All right. We're talking about the reign of Pope Gelasius II, during which, well, it wasn't very long, but still some interesting things to note. So we're talking about the fact that Pope Gelasius II had to escape from Rome under cover of darkness. Popes have sometimes had to run away from Rome itself due to various troubles that have arisen. So another letter, we'll go back up to that just a little bit. Gelasius escaped under cover of darkness and landed at Gaeta, his native city, where he was received with respectful and pious eagerness. Henry had in the meantime, so this is Henry V, son of Henry IV of Germany, who's just about equally as troublesome as his father, if not worse. But in any case, he had procured at Rome the election of an anti-pope, Maurice Bourdon. We talked a bit about him. The false legate excommunicated by Paschal II in the Council of Beneventum. So he assumed the royal purple with the title of Gregory VIII. The true pope was consecrated at Gaeta in the presence of William, Duke of Apulia, Albert, Prince of Capua, and a host of Italian lords who swore fidelity to his cause and authority. So remember, when Gelasius II was elected, he was only a deacon. It's not to put down the order of diaconate in any way. It is, in fact, divinely instituted, but it is obviously much less than being a priest and certainly less than being a bishop. And the pope has to consent to being consecrated a bishop in order to truly become pope, if he is not already one at the time of his consecration, or election, rather. So sometimes that happens. Most recently, I think the most recent case of that, someone who was not a bishop being elected pope, was Pope Gregory XVI in the early to mid 19th century. He had to be consecrated a bishop and crowned pope the same day. So the ceremonies probably went on for 12 hours or something to have all of that done on the same day. It must have been quite the day. But in any case, yes, he certainly was. He had been, Pope Gregory XVI had been a Camaldolese monk, and so he had been a cardinal and prominent in the church before his election, but he had never been consecrated a bishop. Sometimes that is possible. So it doesn't usually happen, but it can. So the true pope was consecrated. It seems to say consecrated. That seems to mean consecrated a bishop, but at the very least, crowned pope there. But in any case, we did see that he was a deacon when he was elected. He convoked a council in Capua where he solemnly excommunicated the anti-pope and Emperor Henry V, at the same time directing the Archbishop of Toledo and the bishops of Spain to provide another incumbent for the See of Braga, instead of Maurice, whose intrusion had cut him off from the bosom of the Catholic Church. So yes, obviously, to declare oneself an anti-pope and to go into schism, that cuts one off from the church in every possible way. So that's just something to keep in mind in canon law. It's a misunderstood, sometimes cited, but actually misunderstood canon, to a significant extent misunderstood canon 188, specifically point 4, that says that defection from the Catholic faith automatically, completely, it's a tacit resignation is under the heading, tacit resignation from any office, any ecclesiastical office that is held. So some in the past, it's actually not something that even totalists use much, because it's actually fairly easily answered by anybody. But in the past, that has been pointed to say, okay, well, defection from the Catholic faith, obviously Vatican II being a new false religion, that those who adhere to it have automatically or tacitly resigned their offices, and that is by law of the church, that they resign those offices. Defection from the Catholic faith is, it's actually, in the first place, interesting to note that whole section of canon law is not a penal section, you might say. It does not regard penalties. For example, other things that include tacit resignation from office include accepting another office that is incompatible with the first. So it's just listing a number of things that include, okay, someone has clearly just given up his office in this case. So if somebody just received another office, even if he doesn't send in any kind of official resignation letter or anything like that of his previous one, he still just vacates and goes and takes up another post. He's clearly resigned that other office. Even if he never said those words, he clearly did. So what Canon 188.4 is talking about, defection from the Catholic faith, means somebody just up and leaves. So imagine a pastor of a parish or something, goes crazy someday and just leaves, just up and leaves, and goes and becomes a Lutheran or something. Doesn't even wear clerical garb anymore or anything. Obviously, he's just resigned his office. Even if he never said it, he's still just up and left. He's gone. That's tacit resignation. Doesn't require any further formalities or anything else. They're just the bishop, the local bishop. The ordinary would just put somebody else in that place. And okay, there you go. He's somebody else now. And so, yes, certain things do indeed cut one off from the church completely, but that is that is also a sense in which becoming a heretic is completely cuts someone off from being a member in the church in every possible way. It'd be impossible for somebody like that to be elected pope, for example. But it's really just a failure. The arriving at the totalist position, and whether you agree with it or not, it just has to be acknowledged that those ideas were arrived at just due to a lack of making distinctions, proper distinctions to be made concerning the very laws of the church. And so it's those that whole section of canon law, which canon 188 is included. When you look at it, it's just listing different things that include tacit resignation, some of which are crimes. Obviously, defecting from the Catholic faith is a sin. Most importantly, a sin against the divine law and a crime in that sense, worst of all. But it is also a crime against canon law. It's true, but that particular canon doesn't even consider whether it's a crime or not. It's just, what are the things that include a tacit resignation of office? Oh, you completely just abandon the church? Well, yes, you're considered to have resigned your offices, any offices that you held in the church from the moment that you abandoned it. So that's all that particular section of the law looks at. Other things are not crimes. Obviously, to accept a promotion and go to a more important post, which requires you to leave one that you were holding previously, that's not a crime. That's just accepting a new job. So that's so it's definitely not a crime, but still a tacit resignation. And just a point on that. Whereas, yes, to become an anti-pope, clearly that includes that's maybe let's say defection from the Catholic faith. Maybe a person might still hold all the truths of the faith, but it still is to up and leave the church, clearly. To become an anti-pope or to follow an anti-pope is to become a member, or either the head or the member, at least a member of a schismatic sect. And that's true. So anybody today, what that means is that anybody today who might take it into his head to go and elect a pope has effectively just founded a schismatic sect. So, it's the irony of it would be in a situation like that, or has been, the attempts to do that have always been ones that are very definitely unserious. But if that were ever to happen, anybody were to try that, it would be totalists who have the idea that they can do that. But the irony of it would be that they would constitute themselves as a non-Catholic sect. They see the Novus Ordo as a non-Catholic sect, which those who hold the thesis say that it's not. I mean, it's, in many ways it is, in the sense of how they behave, the fact that, of course, they practice a false religion. In those ways, it is, and according to those aspects, a non-Catholic sect. But it's not legally. So simpliciter, simply, absolutely speaking, you cannot say it's a non-Catholic sect. But it should be. And so, but because it should be doesn't mean that it actually is. And so those who imagine that it is actually in that full sense a sect, they're wrong. But if they were to, starting with that point, that erroneous premise that it is, were to reason that they can go and elect a pope, would them be constituting themselves as a non-Catholic sect, actually. So you see the irony of that and the importance of correctly assessing the situation in the church, the places that errors can lead people. The lesser error can lead to much greater errors. In fact, very naturally does so. All right, so another letter addressed to all the bishops and princes of Christendom acquainted them with the outrage offered to the pontifical majesty and the sentence pronounced against its authors. After the consummation of the schism and a third renewal of the ceremony of his coronation, Henry V returned to Germany, leaving Rome in the hands of the antipope and his partisans. At the risk of life, the intrepid Gelasius succeeded in making his way unknown into the Eternal City, where he remained for some time hidden under the roof of a faithful and devoted family. So this is something that you see fairly often, even when, say, an anti-pope is occupying the church or any kind of hostile, or occupying the city of Rome or some hostile power. There are definitely those who remain loyal to the pope, the true pope, or still recognize the pope as being the sovereign, even the temporal sovereign of the city when he really ought to be. For example, that was the case of the family of Pius XII. The Pacelli family, that there were two groups of families in Rome, those who went along with the seizure of the papal states in Rome, especially Rome itself, and those who still in various ways they gave clear indications that they protested that. There wasn't so much they could do to stop it or reverse it, but that they definitely protested it. For example, they would, those families, they would have in some prominent place in their homes some empty chair on display, clearly indicating that in the temporal power of the Pope is, they still recognize, even if he can't actually occupy it, that he is not only obviously the spiritual head of the church, the visible head of the church on earth, but also is the temporal ruler of the Papal States, even if he's impeded from that. So remember that the state of affairs of Pope still claiming the Papal States, the Italian government just in fact occupying them, including Rome itself. And that lasted from 1871 till the 1930s. So all those decades, there was still this idea, we're going to get the Papal States back. And there were those who were very much still behind that idea, even if there wasn't anything anybody could really do about it to try to bring it back. Definitely, there was still that idea. Eventually, in the 1930s, Pius XI figured, look, we're probably never really getting it back, so let's come up with some kind of arrangement with the government that is, in fact, sitting there. So that then you have the stormy negotiations between Pius XI and Mussolini that resulted in the treaty that produced the Vatican city-state that we know today. So, indeed, Rome has been there's been a lot of trouble in the city of Rome over the centuries. So, but on the feast of St. Praxedes, Gelasius wished to officiate in the church dedicated to the saint. In the midst of the sacred solemnity, the church was besieged by the same Cinzio Frangipani, who had already dared to lay his sacrilegious hands upon the Lord's anointed. So, Stephen the Norman and Crescencio Gaetano, the Pope's nephew, made a desperate resistance. Gelasius II once more escaped in the tumult and reached an isolated cottage in the Roman Campagna, where a poor and aged woman extended the most touching hospitality to the vicar of Jesus Christ. On the following day, he was joined by the cardinals and by some faithful attendants. Let us fly, said Gelasius, let us fly this land of Egypt, let us fly the new Babylon. At the appointed hour, God will bring back those of us for whom that happiness is reserved. So the exiled pontiff turned towards France, a land devoted to the papacy, so at that point perhaps it was. On the 7th of November, 1118, he stepped on the shores of Provence, where he was received by the abbot Suger, minister of King Louis, with all the honor due to the persecuted virtue, or to persecuted virtue. But Gelasius sought rest in the solitude of Cluny, very famous monastery, a spot marked by divine providence as the term of his earthly banishment, and there the heroic pontiff died on the 29th of January, 1119. So modern writers who so strenuously uphold the emperors in the question of the investitures, which maybe at the time of Darius' writing was more of a hot topic, it's effectively just dead now, lay very little stress upon the features of the case, the ones being Henry V raising up an antipope, yet another one. All right, so I'll be right back. I'll print a few more pages before we head on to the Pontificate of Bliss. Just a second. So Calixtus II, February of 1119 to December of 1124. The cardinals who had followed Gelasius into exile elected Guy, Archbishop of Vienne, in Dauphiny to succeed the deceased pontiff. So Dauphiny is a region of France that, which gives its name to the heir to the French throne, very famously, the Dauphin. Which if you may have heard the title in, for example, the life of Saint Joan of Arc, who had to very famously find the Dauphin, the heir to the French throne, and convince him to actually get himself crowned king and take charge of the situation. He was not much good. He just, that's another story. But in any case, for whatever reason, the heir to the French throne has the title of Dauphin, the prince of that particular area. Something like the heir to the English throne is called the Prince of Wales. How that came to be, I'm not sure, but that's how. Sometimes that happens, that the heir to the throne gets a special designation for whatever reason with that kind of title. What that means in the practical order, it may or may not be anything at all, but for whatever reason, that in fact happens. In any case, a little bit of trivia there. They held the election for the successor of Gelasius II there. In fact, they held it at Cluny, and the new pope took the name of Calixtus II. So he received in a strange land, meaning foreign. So strange in English has a sense of being odd or weird. But it can be, has this older sense as well, one that you really don't hear anymore. Certainly not used commonly today, but a sense of just being foreign. So a strange land, foreign land. May or may not have anything odd about it, but it's called strange because it is foreign or alien to something. It has something alien to it. In this case, of course, the Pope to be in France, in the sense that is a land alien to the papacy. That's not where it really belongs. It belongs in Rome, obviously. Now, for a number of reasons. It's very good that the papacy has been in Rome for so long. It was advantageous in the earliest centuries of the church because the church was able to avail itself of the infrastructure of the Roman Empire, being set up in the very capital of the empire. And subsequent to the fall of the Roman Empire, it's also been very good because Italy has always been, even today, effectively, politically very decentralized. So there's never any real risk that the papacy would be seen as just a department of some other state. Everybody knew that then. Even to this day, the Italian central government, such as it is not very serious, or tends not to be. There may or may not be passing prime ministers who are a little more serious than others, but Italian central government is something that's very much here one day, gone the next. And so there's very little worry that it will ever end up controlling the papacy in any sense. Whereas the papacy residing in Avignon in France, even if for understandable motives, is still not a good thing because that definitely came to be the perception. That there's something just controlled by the French state. The Pope is a puppet of the French king, and that's not good, obviously, for so many reasons. In any case, it can happen, and I definitely see here, though, popes have had reasons for getting out of Rome many times, and reasons for not wanting to be there. It tends to be a troublesome place, in fact, or it has been many times, not always, but it has tended to be throughout history a troublesome place. Not exactly always very loyal to the popes who reside there. So the election was held at Cluny, and then this foreign land foreign to the papacy. The scepter, he received the scepter of the proscribed papacy. You know, they were proscribed, not to be confused with prescribed, but proscribed is, well, it has, depends on the context, but in this case, one that people are gunning for, so to speak. That is being given a lot of trouble. People are out for it in some way, and that's why exactly the papacy is taking refuge in France at this point in order to avoid being given any more trouble in Rome itself. But he was soon to restore it in triumph to Rome and to bring peace at length to the church. So he may have, probably the earliest instance of this proscription, where in ancient Rome there were these lists of proscription that different political leaders would put out. So list of people they wanted killed. I put those out, and so kill these people for me, I'll reward you somehow, was the idea. So list of proscription. And so now the term is, by analogy to that, best I can tell, that's the earliest instance of it I'm familiar with myself. So by analogy to that, something is proscribed, then out for that is the idea. So And he's going to bring an end to that. Henry V was beginning to understand that his struggle against the Holy See was one of those questions of principle which could never be resolved to his advantage. Popes might die, but the undying papacy would never give up a just and holy cause. The disorder and moral relaxation naturally developed by the war of investitures favored the rise in the Western churches of numerous sects, more or less closely allied to Manichaeism and tending to raise vice to the dignity of a system. So you see, all of these errors, Manichaeism would eventually rise again in a different form in France under the name of Albigensianism. So it's really similar, the same or at least very similar errors, just regurgitated, reheated, repackaged, to maybe somewhat modified to some extent according to the motives of those who brought it back. But it's really very similar themes coming up again and again. So Manichaeism was, I remember St. Augustine fell to Manichaeism at a certain point. There was a long road for him from living a life of sin, of all kinds of different sins, including being a heretic, before he finally converted. And he even famously had a child out of wedlock before his conversion, St. Augustine. So it's more or less, if there was a sin you could think of to be committed, St. Augustine probably committed it before his conversion. But notice that the church never hides those facts of the lives of the saints. That you might think, well, are not the lives of the saints meant to be examples for imitation? And the answer is yes. The example to be imitated there is the conversion of St. Augustine from his life of sin to being a great saint. So that the church never hides those things. Does not hide with. Sometimes, yes, if a person clearly enough makes up for errors or immoral ways, and to the point of far outshining that, in fact, by virtue, to the point of reaching great sanctity, that person can still be canonized, because very clearly that person gives an example of the fact that it can happen, that a great sinner can be transformed into a great saint. And in fact, if the greatest saints in many cases were very great sinners at one time or another. Just think of St. Paul, for example. He himself talks about the fact that the fact that he was the most zealous persecutor of the church. He outdid everybody else in that. That the Jews really had it out, obviously, for the church at that time, and he was the worst of them all. And he himself says that. Of course, and he went to being the exact opposite. He went to in a good sense, to the opposite extreme, which was in itself an extreme, but he went to, in a disordered sense, but he went from being very zealously a persecutor of the church to being very zealously propagating the faith everywhere. So that's a common enough phenomenon. Grace will transform those who were once great sinners into being great saints. So, Manichaeism, though an error that rises again and again, you'll see it. So these errors were thus a continuation of the series which had agitated Orleans, Arras, and Toulouse, remains of the Eastern Paulicians, and forerunners of all the modern systems which under various names aim at the overthrow of all authority, of hierarchical subordination of the family and society. So clearly there's nothing new under the sun. All of that sounds very familiar, even if nobody ever thinks of any of that as having a connection to Manichaeism, for example. So their doctrinal errors, though agreeing in some points, such as the uselessness of the sacraments, of the invocation and veneration of the saints, and prayers for the dead, are at variance in others according to the names of their leaders. So that is a very common characteristic of error, that those who hold various errors will very easily, even if they started out on more or less the same page, end up disagreeing amongst themselves very quickly. Just look at Protestantism, just how many different Protestant sects there are, denominations as they call themselves. Just how many different ones there are. And they start splitting up amongst themselves. For example, during the time of the American Civil War, various sects, Protestant sects in North America, in the U.S., there are so many of them. They ended up dividing over questions of slavery, for example. And some of them reunited after the war, or some of them didn't. But they split over that. And to this day, I think even the Methodists have ended up, that's the most vanilla, just mainstream, standard Protestant kind of sect you can get. Recently they've divided, I believe it was they who did, over accepting gay marriage versus not. So the more conservative ones, of course, refused it. The more liberal ones went along with it. But they've had another split, and that's in the last few years over that. So they keep splitting up over, they could divide over anything at all. You have no unity of faith. There's nothing to stop that. So very common, or those who hold errors disagree amongst themselves very easily. There's nothing to stop them from turning on each other and devouring each other. Nothing at all to stop that. So those various doctrinal errors, and notice none of those are particularly new. Their view of moral obligations is one, a denial of all authority and rule, license, and scandal. And that is also very common. Many times, even if it's not immediately obvious in some cases, it usually becomes evident upon some degree of examination, consideration, study. Just the fact that error is usually invented to come up with some kind of an excuse for sin. 99.9% of the time, that's the motive for it. Make excuses for sin. There's usually some aspect of it that, the moral law has to be followed, because it would sound bad if they were just to deny that in principle. But they say it has to be, absolutely has to be followed. But if you reach the highest levels, you become the most perfect you can be, then you're dispensed from all that. It's usually something like that. So, once again, even if they might protest, in principle, the moral law needs to be followed, then once you really get into it, no, they're still making excuses for sin. At least for themselves. Personally. So the first of these names, which we meet in the 12th century, is that of Peter Pruis, whose followers styled themselves as Patrobrusians. So, you don't need to go too much into what exactly he said or what stuff that they did, but just know that recognize that name. It's important to be able to recognize the names of various errors. Patrobrusians, that's a name that comes up sometimes in different contexts. He traversed Dauphiny, Provence, and Languedoc. So Languedoc is the area in which Albigensianism would arise, which is named for the fact, Languedoc, that particular area of France, because at least at one time, instead of saying oui for yes, they would say oak for whatever reason. And so the region came to be named for that, the place where they say that. Languedoc, but out of the town of Albi in France is there, where the Albigensians set up their headquarters. So notice that his idea is already being spread there, but that would come up later on, but definitely it was already starting. It would destroy and burn crosses, rebaptize children, teaching that churches are useless, as God wishes no other temple than that of the universe. So all those ideas, you can see, heretics really just copy other heretics. When you see Martin Luther's errors, you realize he was not actually very original at all. He was very influential, sure, but not original. And even as far as his influence went, he just took advantage of an already troubled situation, and already came into a set of circumstances that made people lend their ears to him more readily than would have been the case in other centuries. And also, took advantage of circumstances in the sense that he found people who were willing to protect him. Civil rulers who were willing to protect him. In another century, he would have just been a blip on the radar. He would have been another John Huss, for example. It was a name that you recognize easily enough, but who was put on trial and then executed for heresy. Put on trial. He was found guilty of it, and then when the Holy Roman Emperor, when he realized that, so the Church, of course, put him on trial first for that, and then handed it over to the Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, Sigismund, for trial, and then who was found guilty of heresy as a civil crime and then put to death for that when he was unrepentant. And that's a whole other thing. There's some controversies regarding that, some accusations against the Church on that whole thing. We'll get to that later. But the point is that that's what happens to a heretic in a more ordered situation. Whereas Martin Luther, he got away with what he did because the emperor, Charles V, was definitely had no use for him personally, but couldn't discipline him the way he wanted to, or would have if he'd been able to. So, Martin Luther took advantage of circumstances, but he was not original. So he, Peter Pruis, was followed by excited crowds who butchered priests, plundered and burned churches, and gave themselves up to the most shameful excesses. Henry of Lausanne, the best known of Peter's disciples, carried the same doctrines and disorders into Switzerland and the eastern provinces of France. So Switzerland is a place where sometimes heretics or other, we'll say, other scoundrels sometimes like to seek refuge. So John Calvin set himself up in Geneva, in Switzerland. Protestantism invaded Switzerland fairly early on. And also, in more recent times, Lenin was sent into exile in Switzerland at a certain point. He lived in I can't remember the name, but Zurich. He lived in Zurich, not Geneva. Calvin set himself up in Geneva, but Lenin lived in Zurich for a little while until the Germans sent him back to Russia, and easily their worst move ever of that war. So it seems that's getting into a whole other story, but it seems they didn't actually expect him to succeed. They were just seeking to cause trouble for the Russians, send this revolutionary agitator back to Russia to cause trouble for them behind the scenes. Didn't think he would actually end up successful, like starting a successful, in some whatever sense a revolution is successful. They didn't think he'd actually start a successful revolution. So that's how the Germans just operated. They were always into causing trouble at home for their enemies. For example, they sent a submarine full of weapons to Ireland, which was causing all kinds of. The Irish were taking advantage of the situation to seek independence from London, because at the time, all of Ireland was under control of the English crown, of the UK government. It was the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. So whoever the full name is probably even more to the title than that, but it was not just Northern Ireland as it is today, but all of Ireland was part of that. So they got their independence shortly thereafter, but first, even during the war itself, they got home rule, so more autonomy, and then after the war, they were just completely let go. But the point is that the Germans were big into causing trouble, to the point of feeding agitation in Ireland, just to the idea of cause them a greater headache, cause the English a greater headache, and maybe tie down more of the British army in Ireland, trying to keep things under control there. And there was a lot of agitation. I mean, there was a very famous 1916 Easter uprising in Ireland, for example. That was a big deal. So, Switzerland, you mentioned that because of places where all kinds of horrible people go. That and Holland. Switzerland maybe less so, but definitely Holland is one of those places that if anybody evil in Europe was banished, he went to Holland and hid out there for a while. No, it is something you call it the hell section of Europe. So what that room is for us, Holland is to the whole country is to the entire continent of Europe to some extent. It's one of those places that was Protestant early on. Right. So society was no less interested in religion than religion in the suppression of the sectaries, and hence the severity displayed against them by the secular power, as also towards the Waldenses and Albigenses. So, sorry, there's a typo there, but yeah, we'll see that later on. To whom they acted as an advance guard. So in fact, there were whole wars. There were wars fought against the Albigenses by the French crown. In fact, preached and very much encouraged by Saint Dominic himself. That very famously so. So we'll see that down the line, but that's coming. So Antwerp, that's today Belgium, but keep in mind that also Belgium was for a long time just part of the Netherlands. That Holland, to the official name, as I understand it, of Holland is actually the Netherlands. It's very commonly called Holland. But it's the official name is still the Netherlands, and Belgium was just part of the Netherlands, the Low Countries. Low meaning low-lying territory, and very close, either at or below, whatever, close to sea level. It has to do with how they are relative to sea level. So the Low Countries in that sense. But Belgium, yes, was even called Belgium even before it became an independent nation, and independent from the rest of the Netherlands. But it was that's the Catholic section, was the Catholic section of the Netherlands, and they broke off from the rest because they wanted to have their own Catholic kingdom. It was always liberal, but that came into being in the 19th century, the independent state of Belgium. But it was not exactly a great Catholic state by any means. It was always liberal, caused trouble for the church. It was never great. But that was why they broke off. So on the one hand, they broke off because they wanted to have a Catholic state, but then they ended up causing trouble for the church anyway. So not exactly a great track record. Also, there was this oddity whereby the kings of Belgium were called not the kings of Belgium, but the kings of the Belgians. I don't know why, but that's what they were called. That's the official title, King of the Belgians. Not sure if there's anything more to read into that than just an oddity, but there you go. Anyway, Antwerp, Belgium. That was also the city in, you may have heard of the Race to the Sea during World War I. Because at the beginning of the war, the Germans tried to take Paris. They had this whole plan they've been developing for decades of trying to defeat France very quickly and then turn their attention towards Russia, their other enemy on their eastern borders. And they tried that. It didn't work, very famously. So that's when easily the most enduring images of World War I, those of trench warfare, set in, was 1914 after their failed drive on Paris. They more or less, the two sides settled down and then just dug trenches all the way from Switzerland all the way up to Antwerp in Belgium. That was the Race to the Sea. They were just digging trenches parallel to each other all the way north to Antwerp. Which, that's what that was. A very slow race, but it was a race of digging trenches, in which they just then sat for 4 years until the Germans decided to start going on the offensive again. But anyway, Antwerp was that was to hear about the Race to the Sea. That's the city where it ended. And the Germans besieged Antwerp and took it. But anyway, Antwerp had been thrown into a state of similar disorder by a fanatic named Tanklin, so a couple different spellings of the name, though his aim was somewhat less moderate than that of his fellow sectaries, since he claimed to be adored as a god. So he revived the traditions of the Adamites, and the exact peculiarities of his position are not all that important, but the point is, you have other people causing trouble at this time. So the misguided people of Antwerp were recalled by the preaching of St. Norbert. Tanklin's followers were found in Flanders, so that's a section of, I think it's a region more than it's not a state. It mostly is, if I have the correct idea of the exact borders of it in my mind, then it's partly in Belgium, partly in northeastern France, Flanders. But again, this area in which World War I was fought is a very, very famous poem called in Flanders Fields or something like that. I forget the exact title, In or On Flanders Fields, but it's about all the people who died there. And yeah, a lot of people died there during those wars. And to this day, actually, they still find unexploded munitions and all kinds of different things in that area. So that actually farmers in that area, it's a fairly rural area. A lot of small towns, very nice small towns, many of which were destroyed in the war. But to this day, farmers in those areas have to have essentially metal shielding on the undersides of their farm equipment so they don't get blown up while plowing their fields. Because there's still munitions there and they're still dangerous. 100 years plus after the fact, and actually more. So it started in 1914, so 112 years ago this year it started. And to this day, it's still finds stuff there. Because they apparently, I'm not sure who calculated it, but from what I've read, maybe about a third of all the munitions fired there were duds. So they had all kinds of defective ignition mechanisms, apparently, whereby they would fire off all these munitions and they would just not explode. They would just sit there and remain there to this day. Those things don't just go away. I even heard that in the 1950s, there was a lightning strike that blew up a mine or something, some kind of explosive that had been planted and never detonated, and a lightning strike set it off in the 1950s. So that's what they're dealing with to this day in that area. Anyway, Flanders. It's Flanders. So Tanklin's followers were found even in Flanders on the banks of the Rhine and infested the Diocese of Cologne. They affected a life of poverty and austerity, opposed the power of the Pope and of all ecclesiastical authorities. So a few more details about these people. It doesn't matter all that much. So now we move on to the pontificate of Honorius II. 3 days after the death of Calixtus II, the cardinals and bishops met at the Basilica of St. John Lateran and elected as Pope Theobald, the cardinal priest of the title of St. Anastasia, who took the name of Celestine II. So once again, cardinal priest, he could have already been a bishop. It seems he was. There's no mention of his having to be consecrated, so probably he already was a bishop. But cardinal priest could still be a bishop. It's just in the hierarchy of the cardinals, he was designated as a cardinal priest. So hardly had the new pope been clothed with the pontifical vestments, while the clergy and people chanted the solemn Te Deum in thanksgiving, when Leo Frangipani rushed into the church at the head of a seditious faction, shouting tumultuously, "Lambert, Bishop of Ostia, is our Pope." So proclaiming then, "Long live Lambert, the sovereign pontiff, the father of the Romans." So the disorder was momentarily increasing, momentarily here meaning moment from moment, moment by moment, getting worse and worse, when Celestine, in order to appease it, had the modesty to yield the tiara to his opponent. So that's interesting that he would be willing to do that, because say a pope could say, "No, forget it, get out of here. I'm the pope, go away." But he said, "Okay, we don't want to start another schism. All right, fine." So the cardinals consented and ratified the choice made of Lambert, whose guilt consisted only in his name being thus made the cry of a faction without his consent or participation. So he apparently had no part of it, just for whatever reason. Maybe they just didn't like, he was at Theobald for whatever reason. They just didn't like him, these people, headed by this Frangipani character. They wanted Lambert for whatever reason, and without his being involved, they just thought he was a better choice. So Theobald says, "Okay, fine, for the good of the church, for the good of souls, to avoid another schism. Okay, fine, take it." And they said, "Okay, we'll go with that." So Lambert was accordingly enthroned in the pontifical chair and took the name of Honorius II. After an interval of 7 days, when peace had been completely restored, so all the tumult had died down, he called the cardinals together and declared to them that he did not wish to keep a dignity perhaps unlawfully obtained and certainly imposed by force. Then, removing his tiara and red cape, he placed them in their hands. So he was willing to give it up after that. So he didn't want it, clearly. It shows that, indeed, he was not involved in whatever sedition was taking place there on the day of the election. So thus, within the same week, 2 cardinals gave a bright example of perfect disinterestedness. So it seems they were both good candidates in that sense. One was willing to give it up in order to prevent a schism from starting, and the other was willing to give it up once it was clear that danger of schism had been avoided, and he didn't want to appear to have been involved in that sedition, or to himself to be the occasion of a schism by holding on to something that people could say, "Oh, that was done under pressure." So the assembled cardinals, though touched by this noble proof of humility, threw themselves at the feet of Honorius II, entreated him to keep the rank of which he had showed himself to be so worthy, and swore on the spot to be ever truer to his authority. All right, so that's an interesting way in which to start this pontificate, that's for sure. And so a few years later, Cardinal Matthew, the papal legate in France, had opened a council at Troyes. He wrote to St. Bernard. Remember we mentioned St. Bernard of Clairvaux having started his monastery during some years prior. He wrote to St. Bernard begging his presence. St. Bernard received a positive order to repair to the Council of Troyes. So to make a long story short, he declined out of humility. But then receiving a more or less direct command, a positive order, as we see here, to show up, he finally went. And it was under his inspiration that the Venerable Assembly settled the difficulties then harassing the Church in France, and applied to the reform of clerical abuses a number of regulations highly extolled by contemporaneous authors for their wisdom and energy. The council then charged the Holy Abbot of Clairvaux to frame a constitution for the Order of Templars. So, Hugh de Payen, that's a very oddly spelled name, but in any case, best I can tell, that's the pronunciation that it should have. The founder of the order had come to the council for that express purpose. So the reason we're bringing this up, for one thing, it's just interesting to see how these monastic warrior orders functioned, how they lived. But also this is to show that the Templars are, whatever accusations came up against them later, and it seems that there was at least some truth to them, that they started out well. Some people say, here Templars, and immediately Freemasons and all kinds of bad things. Eventually, the Freemasonry connection, I'm not, as far as I can tell, I'm not sure what basis there is for that at all, if anything. But whatever true accusations of wrongdoing there are to be leveled against them, it was not from the beginning. They were not bad from the beginning. So that needs to be clearly understood. So the rule gives, St. Bernard wrote their rule, in fact. So the rule given him by St. Bernard with the approval of the fathers, meaning fathers of the council, consisted of 72 articles, which afterwards underwent should be one word, various modifications in proportion to the increase of the order. So the following points seem to be nearest to the primitive rule that in ordinary times the knight shall assist at the whole of the office day and night. So they really were a monastic order. being required in principle to assist at the entire office. And that's what the Benedictines do. That's their whole life, is singing in the office. And that is, in fact, the case. Actually, people sometimes get the idea that monks in the monastery spend all their time working in fields and stuff like that. Maybe some of them, but not the choir monks. They're focusing. You can see just how much work it goes into having daily masses in any particular place. To sing the entire office every single day. That's a full-time job. Especially considering that matins and lauds are meant to be sung in the middle of the night. But that's why it's called matins. Matutinum refers to midnight. Yes, they're meant to assist with the entire office, truly being a monastic order. So should military service render this attendance impossible, they shall say 13 paters for matins, 7 for each of the little hours, and 9 for vespers. So even if they are meant to be, clearly the idea here was to have knights who were living the lives of religious and dedicated to the military protection of the Holy Land, so that they're not to be distracted by the demands of family life or anything like that. And while living in common, also to live according to a monastic rule, but also because obviously sometimes battles happen when you're also filling a military function. They couldn't be at the office. They still had to do something in place of it. So it's actually quite edifying to consider all of this. So you see also the restrictions on their diet. So flesh meat 3 times a week, very specifically, and so also on Friday, using neither eggs nor milk either. So at the death of any member for 40 days after his decease, his share shall be given to some poor man. Each knight may keep 3 horses and an esquire in his service. So they're also still very definitely knights, still nobles, who are trained in warfare. They're forbidden to hunt either beast or bird, and that's because hunting, keep in mind, and nowadays think of hunting, think of somebody sitting in the woods or maybe on a perch in a tree or something waiting for a deer to come along. You think, well, what's wrong with that? There's something to be condemned about that action in itself, if that's your thing, and what's wrong with that? And actually, the answer is, in fact, nothing. Nothing's wrong with it in itself, but keep in mind that in the past, hunting was a very gaudy, clamorous, worldly affair. A great deal of noise and worldly display and pomp associated with it. So that's why you see, and actually it's in canon law to this day, that hunting is forbidden to clergy. That's when it listed alongside things like acting and practicing medicine that are forbidden to the clergy, hunting. But I have to keep in mind what exactly is meant by that. It's clamor. It's not, commentators on the code explain that. That means it refers to clamorous kind of hunting. That it's if a priest has the time and wants to hunt a deer. There's nothing wrong with that in itself, but I don't know who has time for that either. But that's not the thing that's forbidden. But you can see why. In the Middle Ages, that was what we're looking at right now. That would have been considered a worldly activity, and you can see why. So on the day of their reception, we see the vow that they make. Of course, probably to imagine they took all of the. It's not specified here, interestingly enough, but in addition to the regular monastic vows, they took this one as well. They had to promise obedience to the Grand Master of the Order and submission to the statutes of the Blessed Father Bernard. Right, so we'll continue considering the rest of that next time. Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti mens subtuum Christum fugimus, sancti genitrix nostra supplicationes et despicias in necessitatibus, sed periculis cunctis liberanos semper, vigo gloriosa benedicta. Amen. Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.